So, for everyone that is in the music world, music business world, in and around the industry, you probably would have seen in the last couple of days there's been some really big news basically out of the UK, and in particular to do with Warner Music. So, you might have seen it on the news already, you might have read up about it, you might have heard things before it was even announced publicly, but the big news is that Warner Music CEO Tony Harlow is to leave the company. So it was reported, I think, yesterday or day before yesterday. So maybe Monday or Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday, 2nd of September. So we can pull up the article here on Music Business Worldwide. And we'll see here, Tony Harlow to exit as CEO of Warner Music UK. Tony Harlow is leaving his role as CEO of London-based Warner Music UK. In an internal note sent to Warner colleagues today, September 2nd, and obtained by MBW, Harlow said, "I have a bittersweet announcement to make. I've had a lot of luck in my career so far. 6 years ago, that luck culminated in the opportunity to lead a company I love, full of artists that I care about, back in the country where I was born. I'm sad, therefore, to announce my decision to step down from my role as CEO of Warner Music UK at the end of October." So this is really big news, and yeah, I mean, Tony Harlow 6 years ago joined Warner Music. So 6 years ago, it would have been 2019. I was actually at Warner Music at the time that Tony came in as CEO for the UK. I believe he replaced Max Lusada, who I think stepped up to more of a global role at the time. I remember being there. I was working in the catalog division at Warner when Tony joined. I hadn't heard much about him. You know, I'd been at the company for maybe a year or so. I joined Warner in 2018, and you know, from everything I've seen, from the words and the speeches I heard, Tony speaking, from the meetings he spoke in, he seemed like a good guy. He seemed like a leader, someone that, you know, people at the company were able to look up to. I think not long after Tony had joined as the CEO of Warner in the UK, I actually left to go to BMG in 2020, sort of summer of 2020. So I wasn't there for too long whilst Tony was CEO, but obviously his total tenure has ended up being 6 years at Warner, and now it's coming to an end. So we're going to get into this. We're going to break down what's going on, why Tony's leaving, why we think Tony's leaving, what's being said. But it's not just about Tony here, because the thing with this announcement of Tony's exit is it's coincided with some other news from Warner with regards to sort of an executive restructure of sorts. And I think the really fascinating thing here is that Tony, you know, typically with executive positions, generally most positions I'd say in a corporate, especially from my experience working in the labels, if someone leaves, you kind of expect a replacement. You know, you kind of expect that it's one in, one out, one in sort of thing. It's like for like, a substitution, if you were. That's not necessarily happening here. And this is why it's really interesting. So, yes, there is someone that is going to be, quote unquote, taking the reins. However, their remit of responsibility is actually going to be significantly less or significantly more fractured or fragmented than Tony's was, or still is, up until October. So it's a very interesting time at Warner. And, you know, I think the fact that we're not actually seeing a like-for-like replacement says a lot. I think it speaks a lot to the current and the future structure of not only Warner Music Group as one of the leading record labels globally, but the wider music industry and what it means for the wider music industry. I think it speaks to how this current UK model hasn't necessarily delivered, maybe in particular for Warner Music, but again, a point that could be potentially spoke about globally, and that whilst this new restructure is being reframed as sort of a leaner and stronger Warner Music Group, which very much it could be, is that really the case, or is it more of a case of the UK is starting to signal red flags with regards to not only performance but future potential? We're going to break it all down. It's a really interesting topic. I think, yeah, we'll get to it. But I think, with regards to the UK and the market growth or slowing down of growth, we'll talk about it. We're going to talk about it. But I think it's fair to note that if you talk about like the biggest artists in the world over the last couple of decades, UK has a strong presence in that list. Yes, obviously you've got your American/Canadian superstars. You've got your Ariana Grandes, your Justin Biebers, your Drakes, your Weekends. You've got all these superstars that come from the other side of the Atlantic. But like I said, in the last 10 years or 20 years, even less maybe, in that list, you also include Harry Styles. You also include Adele. You also include Lewis Capaldi. You also include, a lot of other UK acts. Ed Sheeran, big Warner signing. Big Warner signing. Stormzy, to a certain extent. Again, very big Warner signing up until, his last project or two, which were Universal projects. So we're going to talk about the UK. We're going to talk about it. But let's first look into Tony. So, as I said, Tony, 6 years as CEO of Warner Music UK, coming to an end at the end of October. So, a mid Q4 change for Warner Music. So Harlow initially joined Warner in 2010 as the managing director for Australasia, where he played instrumental roles in breaking artists such as Ed Sheeran and Dua Lipa. Dua Lipa is on that list as well. How could I forget Dua Lipa? Wembley Stadium sellouts, all of that. Excuse me. So in 2016, in 6 years after Harlow joined the company, he was promoted to the role of president for Warner's then global artist services arm, WEA, a position for which he relocated from Sydney to New York City. Harlow was then named leader of Warner Music UK in late 2019, taking up the position in February 2020. So there you go. Yeah. So I'd left Warner. I left Warner in July 2020. So it was only a matter of months I was there whilst Tony was there. But like I said, I think it was he was a great guy. Everything that I heard about him, every time I heard him speak, he gave very good leadership energy. He gave good vibes as a leader. He gave approachable. He gave friendly. He gave sort of, you would trust him. Do you know what I mean? Like as an employee, you would kind of like feel that, okay, this company has some sort of guidance. It's going somewhere, and we're good here. So Harlow was named in 2019, took up the position in 2020. So this is an interesting part. In his memo to Warner staff today, Harlow said that he's only making this announcement now after thinking long and hard about our team and what needs to be done for the UK to lead the world again. Now this is a really super interesting point, and this is where we're going to get into it a little bit. basically what you could read. So let's just read on. Sorry. So I've realised that my departure would create new long-term opportunities and space for our amazing senior management team to continue to grow as individuals and as leaders. So this is really interesting. So if you look at, I've just reeled off a bunch of sort of global superstars, both UK and US, right? So transatlantic list of superstars. But if you kind of look at the last 5 or 6 years of, I guess, who's really created global superstars out of nowhere. And I say out of nowhere, there's a lot of work and effort that goes into these campaigns. But let's take, if I ask you, think of a superstar that kind of has popped up in the last few years. Who you gonna say? You're not gonna say Harry Styles because he's been around now for a long time. You're not gonna say Adele because she's been around now for a long time. You're not going to say Ed Sheeran. He's been around for a very long time. You're not going to say Stormzy. He's been around for a long time. Lewis Capaldi's been around for a while. Dua Lipa's been around for a long time. She's one of Warner's, most successful projects, you could say. Maybe I'm missing some top UK acts. They're kind of the top table when you sort of think of this stuff, right? The one artist that really comes to my mind when people ask, who's really popped off in the last few years to a global level, well, there's two really. The Central C. Now, that's me thinking in a UK lens, and that's me thinking as a rap head, hip hop head. I think it's fair to say he's sort of surpassed one genre. He's done a global tour. He's done a whole tour globally, right? So you could consider him a global superstar. He's not a Warner project. The only other one I can really think of is not a UK artist. And also, just quickly on Central as well, he has actually been around for a while. He's not necessarily a newcomer to this, but at global level, yeah, fair enough, right? The only other one I can think of is US, and it's Sabrina Carpenter. Now, I'm pretty sure that Sabrina is I'm pretty sure that she is American. I can't remember. I think she might be Universal. I don't know where she's actually from. I'm assuming it's America. I'm assuming it's I'm assuming it's in America. Pennsylvania she's from, right? So she's American. Where is she signed to? I'm pretty sure it's Universal, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure that it's not a Warner project. Let's just double check that. Island, there you go. She's signed to Island, which is a subsidiary of Universal. Okay. Maybe I'm missing someone. You let me know in the comments if you think I'm missing someone. But off the top of my head, we're talking global superstars, transatlantic. The last sort of couple. I say global superstars, I mean global superstars, right? I mean people with longevity with regards to their career. They're not just around for one album. They deliver multiple very successful, very well performing albums, well streamed, well bought, well purchased, good merch, strong tour, for a number of years. I'm not just talking a one-off campaign. I'm not just talking Little Pump. You know what I'm trying to say? So, let me know if I'm missing someone, but that's what I can think. That's what I think when I hear this. So this is why it's really interesting, because Harlow has basically said that after thinking long and hard about how our team and what needs to be done for the UK to lead the world again. So I name these artists, these UK artists, and they're some of the top streaming artists globally, and they're from this tiny small UK island, right? Impressive in its own right. But in the last 6 years, the last 5 years of specifically within Tony's tenure, I'm not sure you can say that there's been a breakout specifically from Warner Music either on that global scale. Now, I think it's important to sort of look at the wider industry and what's been happening, like the global backdrop of what's happening with regards to UK industry and UK music, and not just lay it onto Warner and lay it onto Tony's tenureship as CEO of the UK label, UK arm. So we have to look at the wider UK data, right? So, and something that's really interesting is a report by the BPI. So for those that don't know, the BPI, British Phonographic Industry, it's kind of like the governing body for music industry trade. You know, it's kind of the sort of go-to source. It's the company that sort of administer the sales numbers and like the certifications for albums when they sort of go platinum or silver or gold or whatever it is, right? So last year they had a report, music export growth report. So music export growth report scheme distributes a record £1.6 million to 67 artists from across the UK as the fund marks its 10th anniversary. So this report was from last year, 2024. But there was a really interesting stat in here, which I found quite, I guess, concerning in a way, but also it definitely speaks to the wider industry and what's been happening in the wider industry, globally, I mean. And that is the UK's share of global market. So here you'll see, despite record annual growth of UK recorded music exports to £709 million in 2022, overall, the UK's share of the global market has slipped from 17% in 2015 to around 10% today. So that would have been last year. So we're talking about a 7% decrease since 2015 globally. Now, when you sort of think of, you know, the big artists that the UK exports globally, but then you sort of see this dip in global market share, it's quite concerning. It's quite concerning. It's almost like, well, we're looking at this stuff through a UK lens and we don't really understand why it's the case. But then I think you just have to look across the world, the map, and you sort of understand that there's a huge amount of expanding markets. There's a huge amount of competing genres. There's K-pop, there's Afrobeats, there's Latin, there's reggaeton. And all of these markets are basically eating into the UK's market share, which, by the way, is a premium market share. What the UK holds, premium streaming rates. It's considered one of the leading markets for streaming globally, for music globally, let alone streaming, right? And it's clear, like, I think they mention it in the report here as well. So emerging British artists are vying for fans alongside the deep catalogue of music available on streaming services and artists from almost every corner in the world, including long-time music powerhouses such as the US and Canada, rapidly expanding markets. This is it, rapidly expanding markets, including South Korea and Latin America. So I've already spoke a little bit on sort of expanding markets. I've done a couple of videos on Africa with Jay Huss. I've done a video on India last year as well, and they're extremely sort of growing market over there. And so this backdrop also has an impact on the UK performance, right? And specifically in this case, we're talking about Warner Music's performance. So I think it's fair to consider that when we're looking at what's actually been happening with this with what's going on. So we know Tony's leaving Warner. We know that there's significant global challenges for the UK market, and we also know from the reports and what's been released, we also know that there is no necessarily direct replacement for Tony, and that is because there's going to be a structural reshift, a structural change to Warner Music setup in the UK and thus globally. So we're going to look at that now. So it's really interesting, this sort of setup. So as we've discussed, there's no real direct replacement for Tony. There is someone coming in to basically do his job, but the setup is going to be different. And this guy is called Simon Robson. Now, I remember when I was at Warner, and at the time, Simon, I believe, was head of Southeast Asia or Asia in general, maybe APAC in general, for Warner Music. And Asia's always been a really interesting market for me. I've always sort of followed what's been going on in that market. I think it's a very exciting place. I think there's a lot going on. And so when I heard that Simon was coming to do a talk at the London office, I sort of had to be there. I remember it was on the fifth. I think it's the fifth floor, which is where Atlantic is, and in the main boardroom at the top. It was in there, and he sort of came and just did a presentation on like Warner Music's presence in the APAC region, in Southeast Asia specifically. And obviously I came locked and loaded with questions. I wanted to try and like impress him, and young, hungry, wide-eyed, industry fresh, what I mean, just trying to get in and make something happen. And so I remember he was in there and he spoke to everyone about what was going on with Asia. And again, he seemed like a really cool, switched on guy. Like, you typically, I think when you're trying to do something in the music industry, obviously you are quite wide-eyed and impressionable when it comes to like hearing about all the cool projects and all the stats and everything. Obviously you probably come across characters that you don't necessarily take to, but my very limited exchange with Simon was positive, and we had like follow-up emails and exchanged a few messages here and there. He was there to sort of help me understand the market a little bit better, and me asking for experience, he introduced me to some people and that sort of thing. So again, only positive experiences from talking to Simon for the very limited period that I did. But here's the interesting thing. So Simon Robson, Warner Music's EMEA, so Europe, Middle East and Africa, EMEA president, is set to lead Warner Music UK following Tony Harlow's October exit. So on the face of it, this is a sort of like-for-like replacement. Tony out, Simon in, but that's not necessarily the case. And here's why. The reason is there's a reshuffle. Now, this reshuffle is very much to do with the transatlantic relationship that Warner is trying to generate between the US and the UK. Obviously, on both sides of the Atlantic, you have Atlantic Records, you have Warner Records, you have Warner Music Group, So, WMG formally disclosed that framework today. After July brought an ADA recalibration, and August ushered in changes at 10K being obviously Universal's label run by Elliot Grange, or previously run by Elliot Grange, son of Lucian Grange, Universal's CEO, as well as the mentioned Atlantic. So this is just a few different restructures that have been happening, right? We're going to talk about Robert Kinsell in a minute. So he's a current new CEO, global CEO of Warner Music. I believe that's his role anyway. But yeah, we're going to talk about him in a minute. He's an interesting character as well. So diving into latest developments. Yeah, we talked about Tony already. This is where we want to sort of break it down. So basically, Robson's new role will extend only to certain of Warner Music UK's teams. So he's only going to be in charge. He's only going to be managing a few, or not all, Warner Music UK teams, right? including the shared services that support both Atlantic and Warner Records. So this is the interesting part. That's because Atlantic UK co-presidents Ed Howard and Bryony Turner, they were both there when I was there as well, are shifting to the overarching Atlantic Music Group, and they'll be reporting directly to the unit CEO, Elliot Grange. So but basically what's happening is Ed and Bryony, who run Atlantic in the UK together, are now no longer reporting to a UK CEO, but they're going to be reporting directly to the CEO over in the US, over in the States. Similarly, Joe Kentish, who was at A&R at Warner when I was there, he's currently the president of Warner Records and Parlophone Label Group. They had their own sort of restructure not so long ago as well. Is signing on with Warner Records proper, i.e. meaning Warner Records, the label in the US, and reporting to appropriate group's head, Aaron Bayshuk, as well as COO Tom Corson. So the same thing that's happening with Atlantic UK, the leaders of Atlantic UK are now reporting directly into the US. The same thing is happening with Warner Records and Parlophone in the UK. They're now going to be reporting directly into the US. So there's no more reporting for these two, which you could probably say are flagship frontline labels for Warner Music Group. They're no longer reporting to a UK CEO. The UK CEO is no more. They don't have any sort of, well, I mean, they'll have some impact. Simon will have some impact with his team, but the direct report is going to be into the US. Now, this is a significant update. This is a really interesting update. The way Warner Music higher-ups see things, the enhanced transatlantic partnership, will ultimately help artists achieve greater global impact. So this is super interesting. And I think it definitely speaks to this whole idea of British artists not really necessarily being at the forefront over the last few years, and not really having anyone break that much especially from Warner Music. So Robert, the current global CEO, made a comment on this as well. The strategic move will put more firepower behind British artists, Kinsel communicated in part, while strengthening the UK's place in our ecosystem as one of our highest priority markets. Above all, both our US and UK teams will be able to better mirror the way music moves in the world, further strengthening WMG's collective impact and competitive edge. I think Robson also mentioned, I'm looking forward to working more closely with our UK artists and leaders as we continue to introduce the most distinctive British voices to the world stage. So, I guess in a way, objectively, you could look at this and you could be like, well, is that not counterproductive? Because you're saying you want to focus on breaking UK artists globally, you want to give them a voice, you know, the global music market overall has seen the UK suffer a little bit, has seen it sort of decline. But then you're not going to have like a proper UK CEO where the flagship labels in the UK answer to a UK CEO, right? Like, you could look at it from that perspective. But then you could also sort of go along with what Warner are saying, which in a way, I guess it makes sense, because we're in a very much a globalized economy now. We're in a globalized consumer economy. We're consuming content from all corners of the world very easily, very quickly. And so if there has been success in particular markets, i.e. the US, why would the UK not want to tap into that? Why would we not want to utilize their resources, their connections, their contacts, their experiences, their data to be able to break British acts in the, in not only America but globally, right? So I think it from a like overall strategic omniscient sort of perspective, it makes sense. But then you could, like I said, you can sort of look at it both ways, right? Because typically speaking, there's, changes are political, if not driven by poor performance. Or, people just might be ready to move on and retire, and that might be happy. The company might want to change and they might want to change, so it just all adds up nicely and merry, happy, everyone goes on their way and everything's good. But here, for me, from what I'm seeing in this, it kind of basically is saying that the UK is underperforming and we need to do something about it. So this is what we're going to do. And that's absolutely fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I think if anything, that's good leadership. I think if something's not working as it should, or it's not achieving what you want it to do, then we need to address it and we need to structurally change the strategy. And this is what we're going to do. So that's what's happened. Those are the changes, and the big changes. I think, to not have necessarily someone to answer to in the UK. I'm sure Simon will have sort of oversight on overall strategy and that sort of thing, but to not have someone just sort of there all the time, answering with the flagship labels, answering to them, is quite a significant update. I think it's a really interesting update. I think, you can also maybe look at it with regards to cost efficiency. I think, again, we're going to look at Robert Kinsell soon, but I think removing a layer of exec level always helps the bottom line on the P&L. I think having a global integration between labels across the Atlantic, it means that there's fewer sort of layers, less bureaucracy to go through. You're able to act quicker. I think like companies of any significant size might struggle with being able to act quickly, but I think it can help having less layers. So I think there's probably a couple of interpretations or a couple of motives behind these moves. And then obviously I think that the pressure as well, like the UK not performing as it should be, not even not performing, but maybe not creating the global hits that they want it to. You look at the current artists like Ed Sheeran on the Warner books for a number of years, all of his albums. But realistically, he's kind of you could say that he's coming to the end of his cycle. Like he's peaked as a commercial artist. I'm not sure his last album performed commercially as well as his previous albums. We could look at that, but I don't think we need to. I think it's pretty clear, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I don't know if Ed really cares about that or his team. I think, but who does care about it are those people responsible for the shares, the share prices, the stock market, the shareholders of the company, the stakeholders in Warner Music. Numbers are important. They drive the share price, and if we're not delivering hits, if Warner Music aren't delivering hits in the UK, when historically speaking the UK has been one of their sort of biggest, most important markets, then that's something to be concerned about, and that's something to act on. So that's where we're at with that. Now, speaking of performance, I think it is important to sort of address Warner Music's revenues as of late, just so we're not making this up. This is definitely something that's been happening. This is definitely something where there's room for improvement, or there's been a decline in growth for the UK market. So Q1 results were published a couple months ago now. So Warner Music generated $1.48 billion in Q1 calendar 2025. Subscription streaming revenues rose 3.2% year on year. So obviously that's the headline. They're going to lead with a strong stat, something that's impressive, happy, makes people not worry too much, and it is a positive result. It's I think any growth is good growth if you're trying to achieve what these companies are trying to achieve. So the overall growth, so we're looking at $1.484 billion in Q1. Total revenue was up 1.2% year on year at constant currency. So whilst it's up, it could be seen as a very much a slowdown in growth. I think it's 1% isn't. I mean, it's significant when you're talking about billions of pounds, but it's not significant. It's not something you'd run and tell your dad about. Do you know what I mean, or your mom or whatever. So the company pinned its revenue performance, i.e. its slowed revenue performance, I think what they're trying to say here, on lower recorded music artist services and expanded rights revenue. So basically what they're saying is there was less recorded music revenue, but this was partially offset by higher licensing and physical revenue and growth across music publishing, digital performance sync, and mechanical revenue. So just off the top of that, just reading that headline alone, to me that says that streaming is not generating the same revenue that it was, or it's not growing at the same pace that it was, but we're getting more licensing deals, we're getting more physical sales, or the margins on physical sales are higher, and there's been growth across publishing, performance sync, and mechanical. So everything but streaming, basically. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about. I think, I did a video on Spotify and Apple, the streaming and the price hikes and that stuff, but essentially that's what Warner are saying at the minute. Interesting to note that following this call where they announced these results, I believe there's reports of the share price dropping 7 to 9% once these calls were announced, and that's because obviously there would have been initial concern because the growth rate had slowed so much. But that typically can be expected after a sales call. I think is fair. Whether profits are higher or lower, it's going to have an impact. Initial direct impact on the share price. So I think that's fair. So we'll look at recorded music now. So recorded music at Warner Music Group were up 0 year on year from 2024 to 2025. That's not that much. That's very minuscule. It's and we've already discussed why they're saying this is. Warner Music's recorded music streaming revenue, including ad-supported and subscription, was up 1.6%. So, including ad-supported and subscription, up 1.6%. Again, not a lot to scream and shout about, right? There was a few sort of reasons for this. I think one of the key things that Warner talked about was sort of the soft ad environment. So yeah, here we go. So Warner Music Group said that the decrease in ad-supported revenue was driven by a soft overall ad environment. So what the hell does that mean, right? So obviously I work a lot on YouTube, and one thing we notice in Q4 is that there's a huge amount of advertising spend. Channels typically generate a lot more revenue because it's Christmas time and brands and companies are spending a lot more on their advertisements to sell their products for Christmas. And so Q4 is typically a very well performing from an ad perspective period of the year. Now this is a Q1 report. This is Q1 year on year report. So we're looking at a decreased ad supported revenue driven by soft overall ad environment. So essentially what they're saying is brands were spending less during this time, and that meant there was a weaker sort of free tier revenue generation from the sort of free tiers of YouTube and Spotify. There's less ads being booked, therefore it's less competitive, therefore the ad rate that the advertisers had to spend was less, and therefore there's less revenue to split between the rights holders, i.e. the labels, i.e. Warner Music, i.e. their revenue drops significantly. So I think that's a fair observation. I think that's a fair assessment of one of the reasons why performance might not have been where they wanted it to be. But I don't think that tells the full story. I think I'm not sure in this report there was much about the maturity of the UK market. I know this is global revenue, but I think it's fair to say that in certain territories the streaming market is matured, and I think there's not as many potential sort of customers for the Spotifys and Apples and YouTubes of the world with regards to subscriptions, right? So I think we're topping out there, and I think that again that's another video, it's another topic we can look at. So it's an interesting reason. It's interesting reasoning. The second thing I think was really interesting here was the BMG deal. So BMG pre-2020, when they signed the 2021, when BMG went direct with YouTube, BMG were distributed through ADA, which is obviously the independent distribution arm of Warner Music Group. And when BMG hired their new CEO, Thomas Coesfield, who was part of the wider Bertelsmann Group, they really accelerated the plan on direct to digital. They called it direct to digital. Direct to digital was essentially BMG strategy to sign direct distribution deals with all the major streaming platforms. So in 2020, that was kind of my role at BMG when I was at BMG looking after YouTube in the UK. YouTube was sort of the first major platform that BMG signed a direct distribution deal with, which means they took all of their catalog out of ADA and they put it straight into YouTube directly. So what that means in turn is, and we can do a whole video on that, the BMG stuff. I think BMG have come out with reports as well recently, their revenue reports, and I think there was a dip in overall revenue. Really interesting considering, their new director distribution strategy and Thomas, a new CEO. So I think we can definitely do a deep dive on that as well. But what it basically means is that for certain major streaming platforms, ADA/Warner Music are no longer getting their distribution fee from BMG's revenues. So that's a huge loss for them. And I think they've noted it here as well. So physical revenue increased 1.8% year on year for Warner to reach $112 million. Driven, Warner said, by new releases in the quarter, primarily in the US and Japan, partially offset by the impact of the BMG termination. So they've definitely cited it as having an impact on their revenues. To what extent, there must be a report on it. We need to look at that deeper. But so again, another reason why they're sort of explaining their performance here. We look further into it. We look at the sort of other revenue avenues. So there's the music publishing, there's performance revenue, sync revenue. All of these are up. Mechanical had the biggest increase of 14.3% year on year, up to 16 million. So much higher physical sales in the quarter. So it's really interesting reading. I think there's a lot of reasons. And I think it's fair to say that the growth markets are stalling, as much as like the UK is a matured market, there are other markets. I think China in particular may have been mentioned, which is considered a growth market, but these growth markets can't go at that accelerating speed forever. I don't necessarily think it's it's long-term sustainable, right? So, here we go. So the company said in its filing on Thursday that streaming revenue was impacted by a challenging year-over-year comparison, largely in subscription streaming revenue, compounded by light release slate and market share loss in China. So there you go. China's a really big sort of growth market for a lot of media companies in general, and for there to be market share loss in that market is going to have significant impact, is going to really affect the bottom line. So I think there's a bunch of different reasons here. And overall, realistically speaking, we're looking at, I guess, an underperforming P&L. I think it would certainly, as a new CEO coming in, it would certainly sort of call for action, I would say. I think the lighter release slate is also a key mention. I think that, I think it's fair to say the lack of releases from global superstars impacts overall performance. And I think that's maybe why the leadership team potentially thought that the UK is not delivering. and that the stars that they have are sort of considered maybe catalog to a certain extent now. And so I think that's definitely a huge factor in this. So why did they make the changes? Why did Warner decide that, despite the greens, despite the small growth that there was, why is it that they decided to cut the whole structure? Tony, is out as CEO, and they're kind of taking this sort of global strategy now. I think from an investor's standpoint, an investor view, obviously Warner Music, publicly traded company. I think having decisive cost-cutting measures, which again Warner have engaged with, along with multiple other major labels across the last year. A lot of people have been affected, right? But removing the UK CEO role kind of fits with that narrative of shift and shape, changing things. But the other thing is Robert Kinsell. So for those that don't know, Robert Kinsell is the current global CEO of Warner Music. I believe that, or recorded music. I believe that's his role. Let's just have a quick check on that. So Robert Kinsell. And I think the interesting thing about Robert is that he actually came from YouTube. He was a YouTube executive before he joined Warner Music. So yeah, he's CEO of Warner Music Group, so overall Warner Music Group. And I'm pretty sure he was at YouTube before that. So in September 22, his named CEO of Warner Music Group, starting in January 1st, 23. Should we just check for YouTube? I'm pretty sure. There we go. He was previously the Chief Business Officer at YouTube, where he oversaw all business functions, partnerships, and operations. Before YouTube, Kinsell was Vice President of Content Acquisitions at Netflix. Oh, so he was Netflix as well. I didn't know that. I might have read it before, but I didn't remember that. So Netflix to YouTube to Warner. Big CV. It's a big CV. Streaming. He's all about his streaming. There's a video I wanted to play about Robert. There's a podcast of Robert speaking, and there was a particular segment that I wanted to play. Let me just bring it up here. So sorry, I don't think I was screen sharing then. So cool. This is the video.
I lost a lot of people, you see. So, his question is, what's been the biggest cultural adjustment you have to make going from a technology company first, like YouTube, to a creative company like Warner Music Group?
I think there are two. I'll name two. The first one is, I think there is this unfair assumption that everybody in the digital world has of, let's say, content companies, that they don't like technology. And when you come into a company like Warner Music, what you realize that all employees want it. They all have it in their personal lives. They have their banking apps, they have their private chauffeur apps, whatever it is. They're living their life online, like very, very well. But they may not have it in their professional life, not because they don't want it. It just hasn't been built for them. And hasn't been made available, but they want it. And I think there's just been this, my assumption was like, yeah, people don't want it. They actually do. So we've been working really hard to obviously fix that and provide as many of these tools as possible. So that's one. So that was a very pleasant surprise. And I would say the other is culturally, the organizations in most media companies are set up in very distributed manners with lots of different P&Ls and lots of different infrastructures. And in today's world, they can function, like global companies can function in much, much simpler setup. So I think, but that has to come with cultural change, right? It cannot happen on its own. But I think that's an important cultural difference, let's say from technology companies or from a whole bunch of companies in other industries which have come up with a simpler organizational design.
Robert,
So that's interesting, right? Because what Robert is basically saying there is that, well, twofold. So he was obviously asked about, what the differences were between sort of the companies he worked at before to now working directly in a media companies as opposed to from the technology end. And he basically alluded to the fact that the technology wasn't quite what it needed to be at these media companies, i.e. the labels, which I think is fair. I think, from my experience working in the major labels, there was always a lot of data challenges. There was always a lot of sort of bureaucracy to get things approved and signed off, and wanting to try new technologies and people being a little bit averse to it. I think it's fair that you'd say most people are sort of open, but you had particular particular people that weren't necessarily comfortable with the idea of embracing new technologies and that sort of thing, right? So that's more than fair. I think that was a fair comment. And the second one, he kind of basically alluded to the fact that operations were messy and sort of having all these different P&Ls, having all these different sort of, setups was just not as tidy. And it's interesting because this podcast came out in April this year, and we're now only a few months later, and it's almost as if he sort of preempted the fact that these shifts were going to happen, which obviously they would have known well in advance, right? They would have seen the data before it was published. They would have had these strategic meetings and these calls to figure out exactly how it's going to work. So, and what he's basically said is that there's better ways to operate companies on a global level rather than having sort of individualized sort of territories. And I think basically that's why it's so important, because, and this what might also be the reason why it could be a positive for the UK, bringing the UK in under the US arm in a sense, and having them operate as one kind of puts the UK on even more of a pedestal than it might have already been on, because essentially what you're saying is this is a very important market. We can't let it slip, and it has to operate the same way that we're operating. And so in the US, and so let's bring it under our umbrella. Let's utilize all the features and tools and data and analytics and resources that we can utilize to help it perform just as our US arm is performing. So I thought that was really interesting from Robert, that little podcast piece there. So, I think it's definitely worth taking into consideration him as a CEO and his push for efficiency, let's say. I think it's fair to say that. And I think it's also fair to say that centralization in general typically always reassures shareholders. It reassures Wall Street. It reassures people that, look, we're Warner and we're serious about our profit margins, and we don't want to risk that. So this is what we're going to do. This is our strategy, and that's reassuring. That gives shareholders something to believe in, and it allows them to feel comfortable with their investments. But that's from an investor angle. I think we can also look at it from a bit more of a creative angle. And when we look at it from that creative lens, I think it's fair to say that coming under the sort of US arm, the UK labels do risk sort of losing their own autonomy and their sort of distinctiveness. Yes, they want to create global superstars, but is the charm of is not the success of Ed Sheeran, his British charm, is not the success of Stormzy, his just utter like unapologetic self. Is the success of, I know the other UK sort of Dua Lipa, is her success not that she's cool and British and cool and 2000s cheek and all that stuff. Maybe I got that one wrong. Dua Lipa, I'm not really her target audience, I don't think. But there's the risk of them sort of losing that autonomy. I think about my A&R friends at Warner and BMG and that sort of thing as well, and in a way, they could potentially, it could be squeezed. You know, having local UK A&R could be squeezed. I think, yes, it's always important to have someone on the ground in the market, but if you're placing fewer bets on sort of UK specific acts and you're looking for that global, more focused, because yes, we're talking about raising British voices, but remember, it's going to work just the same way. Like, obviously, it's always been a lot easier for US artists to break in the UK, but it's going to work in reverse as well, right? It's not necessarily just all about trying to make British voices the top of the industry again. I think that's probably a huge prerogative for them, but if they can utilize the same resources vice versa and get, you know, their US stars over here doing things, and, you know, which they do anyway, but I think, you know, it's not necessarily all about... I think there's a risk. I think there's a risk for the A&R sort of angle from the UK as well. So yeah, that's where we're at. I think there's a lot to take in here, but essentially what we're saying is this exit is more than it appears on the surface. There's a lot going on. It brings to question, you know, is Warner really trying to get ahead of the curve and adapt this to this new era, or are they just sort of cutting costs and masking these deeper cracks that, you know, the wider industry has suffered from and will continue to suffer from? Are we just sort of plastering over the walls here? Like, is this really gonna help them strategically shift the way they're operating and therefore their output? Does it strengthen Warner globally? You know, does it put them ahead of the curve with regards to their competition with their fellow labels, with the Universals and Sonys of the world? Does it weaken the UK scene? Does it make us in the UK less of a market that people will look to, both consumers and investors and sort of labels, you know? Does it mean that we can't be trusted? You know, I think there's a lot to think about here. So let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I appreciate you sticking with me through this one. I think there was a lot to unpack. There's a lot of strategy going on. There's a lot of moving parts to this story. But yeah, we'll take a deeper look at a few other related topics as well. If you liked the video, please drop it a like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Any questions, any feedback, anything I missed, any sort of UK acts you think are global that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years. Let me know. Make sure you subscribe as well. And thank you for watching. Peace.